Well, hey everybody, today I'm going to be interacting with a clip that's part of a debate between the cosmic skeptic and Ben Shapiro. The larger debate has to do with if religion is good for society, and this more narrow clip is going to zero in on some questions about free will. So this will be a little bit of a longer video because there's a lot to engage with here, but let's take a look.
Well, I am glad to begin on a point of agreement with you, Ben, that yes, if there is no God, there is no free will, but I think that's because of the truth of the latter of those statements. That I suppose the biggest criticism that I made of you in a video response that I made to the atheist delusion, and this show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So thanks again.
By the way, I should say it's a great video, and everybody should watch it if they haven't.
Well, I'm going to put that in the description. I think that glowing endorsement. The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle or not so subtle implication in my view that yes, with no God there's no free will, but somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence.
So this is so interesting. I've shared this. If you're a part of LBF Church, you might have heard me share this before because I share it every time the question of free will and sort of determinism or Calvinism comes up, is that my younger brother got his doctorate in philosophy, and his doctorate surrounded the idea of free will and different sort of explanations for free will. And something that he said to me while he was working on it is that he said a lot of Christians think that the whole kind of free will, God's sovereignty, that the whole question about free will is a Christian problem. And he said it's not a Christian problem. Like every worldview runs into a problem when it comes to free will. And I've seen that to be true in so many ways. In fact, years later, I told him, hey, I've said this a bunch of times. Did I get this right? And he said, yeah, that's absolutely right. It's interesting that in this case, where many of us as religious people or as Christians, we can say, well, gosh, it gets weird when you're reading the Bible. Like, do we have free will, God's sovereignty? How does this all work? Where you have this situation with, at least for this atheist, and I know that Sam Harris has said something similar, where Sam Harris, a famous atheist, has said he doesn't believe in free will, where free will is a problem for the atheists. And here, this whole debate is being couched in the only way that you can come up with a way that we have free will is to enter God into the equation. So anyway, a strange putting things on their heads that for those of us who are believers in Jesus, we actually have some basis for believing, even though we might be confused by it, in the reality of free will. Whereas somebody who's an atheist would just believe we're determined by our biology and environment and things like that.
That in order to either say that there is free will, in order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God. And that does strike me as an argument for God's existence.
I mean, to slightly curve that or to kind of sand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural.
Sure.
Now, you can call that God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will. That is not possible. So I know that the way you solve that is that you say that there is no free will.
That's right.
And what I'm saying to you is you don't act that way.
I hear this all the time. People say, look, you may say there's no free will, but you don't act as though that's the case. I suppose that I'm just confused as to what it would look like for somebody to act as if they believe there was no free will. I mean, the very argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do.
Yeah, we all know that word. We all know Schopenhauer. Let's keep going.
That you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will. And that you are essentially just a biological machine reacting to its internal and evolutionary drives. That's what's happening. Now, call that nihilistic if you like. That's a separate question. But
it is
that's
nihilistic.
The question of how this would make one act. The idea that this might cause us to sort of lay around in bed all day or something. The very mechanism that I think is responsible for eliminating the possibility of free will, that is, the drives that make people do what they do, like I say, do exactly that. Make people do what they do. They make them get out of bed in the morning. Why do you get out of bed and go and make your breakfast if there's no free will? So you go and get breakfast because there's no free will in something.
So this is so interesting because I think that with Alex here, that his answer is actually a coherent answer. I almost said a good answer, but maybe it's fair to say it's a good answer. It's a good answer to Ben's criticism or critique of saying you don't live as if there's no free will. I don't think it's a complete answer, but at the very least, he's consistent to this point with his worldview, which he said you might call it nihilistic. It is very nihilistic, just in the sense that there's no point to anything. But I feel like he's coherent in saying, well, I'm doing what a person with no free will would do. I'm doing what my impulses are driving me to do. And he believes that he's self-aware about it, but he still is saying, well, if there's something that I want to do, I go and do it, but it's not actually me. It's my impulses and my neurons and evolutionary biology and my environment and upbringing and all those sorts of things. The point, and I think they might get to this in the discussion, but the point where things really, I think, fall apart and get much more difficult for Alex and not believing in free will is your expectations for other people. So you could say for yourself, if you don't believe in free will, you should say, actually, the way I'm living right now is the way that I want to live. It's the way that makes sense to me. And I don't think that it's actually me. I think that it actually is the neurons. But, who are you to say that if I didn't believe in free will, I would just sit around and not do anything? It turns out that if I don't believe in free will, I'm actually actively doing these different things. I feel like, all right, that's coherent to a degree. What's not coherent is getting to the should in terms of other people, of saying you should do this or you shouldn't do that. You should treat this person this way. You shouldn't treat this person this way. You should vote this way. You shouldn't commit this act of violence. You shouldn't say that online. It's very difficult, which I'm not super familiar with Alex, but I did way back react to one other video with him where he was in a discussion with Konstantin Kisin. And in that, he pretty clearly was advocating for certain sort of non-bullying, more gentle ways to treat people in online discussions. And so he's getting to a should. He's saying this is what we should do. If you don't have free will, and if other people don't have free will, that's a much more difficult sort of bridge to cross. You can cross the bridge of saying, I'm just acting how I act because of my neurons, but so is everyone else, so who are you to critique them?
Thing is driving you to do that's outside of your control.
For sure. So to get back to the nihilism point, which you kind of put aside, so that means that this conversation is essentially worthless in any sort of real sense. I mean, effectively, we were driven here by evolutionary biology and environment to have this conversation. Everybody who's watching this is driven by evolutionary biology and environment to have a particular reaction to that thing, and ever round the cycle goes. That seems like a very purposeless life. Maybe again, I'm drawing from a realm that is not evolutionarily biologically connected. The word purpose is really, teleology obviously has been taken out of the realm of science.
The teleology, it actually comes from the Greek word telos or telos, which has to do with, sometimes it's translated as end, but it has to do with sort of like the end in terms of the purpose. So Ben's getting big picture here. And Ben, if you're not familiar with Ben Shapiro, he's not a believer. You can see him wearing the kippah. He's an Orthodox Jew, or I think Orthodox Jew, or he's a very observant Jew, but has a theistic framework. I mean, at least kind of an Old Testament biblical framework of an involved God. And I think that the points that he's making about purpose are very interesting and true, because if you don't have free will, then the only way you could serve a purpose is if sort of somebody else has a purpose that they are directing you to, or something else has a purpose that they are directing you to. And so you're fulfilling a purpose for someone else, but not really in the sense that you're active and that you can make a choice about whether or not you're going to live to fulfill that purpose in the way that you would if you were on a sports team and you said, all right, on this sports team, I'm a wide receiver on this football team. And that means that my purpose is to get open and catch passes and throw blocks and things like that. You can make a decision about how actively am I going to give myself to that purpose in order to help this team, or am I going to be lazy and sort of be selfish and not look to fulfill that purpose? So Ben is at least acknowledging the idea that it seems to us that a purposeful life would be one that you are making active choices to lean into your purpose, not just that you're passively serving a purpose in the way that sort of a nail serves a purpose to hold up a picture on it. The nail did nothing active, but it's still being I don't know, existing in a purposeful way.
Pretty thoroughly by atheists and by many people in the sciences, although I would argue that, again, most scientists speak in the realm of teleology literally all the time, and they're borrowing language from the language of teleology, even when they're describing functions of particular body parts, right? The heart pumps blood in order to keep you alive, right? They're constantly using language that's teleological in nature. The real question that I have, and this is what goes to the question that you were asking at the beginning, before the sort of pre-question question, which was the good of religion to society. One of those goods is people believing that their free will matters and this actually is a useful thing. So I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology would drive them to do. So you say, well, it's biology that drives you to get out of bed in the morning, which is almost Calvinist in sort of the way that it's described, right? It's like you're predestined to get out of bed in the morning, so thus you get out of bed in the morning.
Not a terribly nuanced understanding of what Calvinism is. I lean more Calvinist than Arminian. Not even lean. I mean, I'm pretty far. And so Calvin is associated with a much sort of more, I don't know if higher is the right word, but with a much stronger view of how God's sovereignty is working in the world. And I think that Calvin is largely right in his view of that. Calvin would not say that he doesn't believe in free will. He believed that there's some sort of mystery, and Calvinists that I know believe that there's some way that these two things work together. Part of the free will discussion is a little bit tricky because some people seem to treat it as if the fact that we're not 100% free means that we don't have free will, because true free, and Sam Harris has this quote on it that I think is really, in many ways, very silly, that because we acknowledge that our biology or our upbringing or our culture or things like that have sort of limited or guided us in ways that there are certain choices that we either couldn't make or just would never make, that means that we don't really have free will. I think what most people mean by free will is what Ben was talking about in that clip right there, is just that I have the ability to make a choice that will impact my situation and the situation. I think Calvinists still believe that that's the case, the ones I've talked to. There might be some super fatalistic ones who act like it doesn't matter what I do, or might be more with the Alex O'Connor, like, well, I do it, but it's only because God has determined that I do it, rather that there's some symbiotic relationship that we don't totally understand, because nobody understands it, where we are making meaningful choices. Our choices actually matter, and they could go one way or the other. And those choices help give us purpose, because to the degree to where we lean into what God has called us to do, we're living out his divine purpose for us.
But the reality is that we are constantly making decisions as though those decisions make a difference in the universe. And what social science actually does tend to show is that when people believe that they have control over their own actions, that when they believe that they're capable of changing the way that they live, they do make those changes with more alacrity and in better directions than if they don't believe that. If people tend to believe in a deterministic universe, they do act worse. So it may work. This is going to be sort of Straussian in its implications, but that may work for you. You're a very high IQ individual who can somehow reconcile the idea of living a very purposeful life with the idea that actually there's no purpose to anything. But for the vast majority of people, that is not actually how they live. And I would suggest that even in your daily life, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, man, my biology is driving me this morning to get on the bike, have a great day, the sun is shining, that's my biology doing this. And I don't think that most people who live purposeful lives, even if they believe that everything they're doing is predetermined by the world around them, by their own biology, I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Of course, but...
And now, part of the reason why the point that Ben is making there was important for this exact context is because the overall debate was, is religion good or useful for society? And so he was making a point that I think is borne out by facts behind it, that if people believe that they can do something, believe that their actions matter in the situation, that leads to better results. And so if religious people, largely speaking, believe that there are things that we can do and that our actions actually make a difference in the world and that they make an impact and that we're to some degree free to make those, then that leads to a better society. Even at this point, sort of it's Ben's not making a case that it is true. Well, I mean, he certainly believes that it's true. He's making more the case like none of us act like anything other than this. We all act like this is true, and the only way to sort of live a meaningful life and not believe that this is true is to trick yourself into believing that it's true. Or I'm sorry, to trick yourself into believing that you do have a free will, even though technically you believe you don't have a free will.
That's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide.
All right, so it's so interesting that he talks about the evolutionary process almost as if it's God. It has done this so well. It has guided us. It has provided for us. It's very interesting that even in his atheistic worldview, there still is this sense of, but there's something that has provided this great thing for us. It's not God, it's the evolutionary process.
Precisely that illusion. I mean, it's not as that. I mean, you say, look, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, gosh, look at my biological
My neurons
drive.
are firing, yeah.
Of course not, because if I did, then the whole evolutionary purpose that this illusion serves.
Again, we're getting into it's so interesting. He doesn't believe that there's God. He doesn't believe that there's a free will. But in a sense, he does believe in purpose. But the one guiding us to whatever role we play in the whole thing is this impersonal evolutionary process.
Would fall away. I mean, you say that this is a fairly purposeless life, and perhaps the implication is that it's a bit of a depressing one. I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the case.
By the way.
It is in fact the case that free will doesn't exist. And we may feel very nihilistic towards that, but as a wise man once said, facts don't care about your feelings.
If you're not familiar, that's a famous line that Ben Shapiro said, but that sort of put him on the map. Facts don't care about your feelings, and so that's why he brought it up there. As believers in Jesus, we can't read the Bible and get away from the idea that God has set before us meaningful decisions to make. Choose life that you might live. Take up your cross and follow me. Love one another as I have loved you. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. And I don't think that we have to get away from the idea that there's some mysterious relationship between God's sovereignty and things like election and predestination and our meaningful choice. I also don't think we have to reject the idea that we are not, when we're doing things, we're maybe not as free as we think we are, because God has really put us into positions that we didn't realize in order to guide us towards making good and godly choices. So I do believe that there's some kind of mysterious relationship there between all of this. But I think the bigger point behind all of this is that the only way to sort of not live a destructive life, if you believe that there's no free will, is to trick yourself into believing that there is free will. And Alex's standpoint is the evolutionary process, this great, almost divinely sovereign process, has guided us to where we fool ourselves. We believe something that's not true. And isn't that great that we believe something that's not true, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to live a good life. Whereas we are blessed with the opportunity to say, the more that I believe what is true, the more meaningful life that I'm going to be able to live, the more significant and even eternally meaningful life that I'm going to be able to live. It's another case where even though sort of the more academically oriented position in our culture right now would be probably closer to Alex's, it ends up being the more incoherent position and the one that involves you saying, I have to basically lie to myself in order to get through this cognitive dissonance.